Hello, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to this year's 2023 Year in Review video. So to start is this image right up here. That is Bar Fight by Todd Lockwood. What you can't see in this picture is right here in the corner, it says 34 out of 300. This is a special edition. Todd Lockwood is only selling 300 copies of this art in this size and this style. There are a couple other options on toddlockwood.com. He is very well known for his Magic the Gathering art, Dungeons and Dragons art. He is a famous fantasy artist, and this art up here, the bar fight image, was from Gen Con's 30th anniversary of D&D event, with what he says in the note is the prompt was that he had to theme it around turkey legs because turkey legs were going to be provided for the participants as part of the shindig, the party, the feast, and turkey legs needed to feature prominently in the art. Well, you can kind of see it, but right there is a turkey leg being thrown in the air. And I think there's one or two others that are being thrown about in this big bar fight. You know, there's such iconic moments as the idle eye being stolen, which is from the Advanced Dungeons and Dragons Idle Eye Player's Handbook cover. There's a mind flayer, a beholder, and what's probably a vampire having dinner in one corner. The mind flayer even has a brain. So there's a very unusual clientele to this bar, and those three huge, powerful monsters are just watching the fight ensue. They're not even intervening. There's some of the iconic D&D 3rd edition characters. The human fighter is here, the sorcerer here, there's a goblin, there's kobolds, there's orcs, there's half-orcs, there's drow. There are a multitude of creatures in this picture. Additionally, I moved around the furniture and bookcases in my room, so now all of it's kind of framed in a way so that the window faces south, the outdoor light is on my face instead of having weird shadows or reflections in my glasses. I purchased some and found some old art and books and whatnot. So behind me on my right shoulder, you see a lot of art that I got this year, including a railroad tie that has been worked in a way, I think it's multiple railroad ties, to look like a rattlesnake. From the same artist is this Roadrunner up here as well. And there's a hunting horn, which I found at my dad's place. I bought when I was 12 years old, and I cannot use it, but it's really cool. There's art that I found while on my first date with my girlfriend. That art is just really cool to me. There's a Ho-Oh and Lugia minifigure, which are both unique to the Heart Gold and Soul Silver release day copies of the game, and so I have those as well. I have the little wood spirit from Wildermyth right on this part of the bookcase. That came in new in December, and I'm just really excited because that is my favorite game right now. Now, on to the books. This year I read 40 books. I kind of read more, and on my Goodreads reading challenge, I have one listed that I kind of feel guilty about because it's a graphic novel and was very different from the kinds of things I read. Now, on to the books that I really, really enjoyed. I'm going to be covering most of the books, but I'll really be covering the highlights. And first and foremost is this book, Untethered Sky. Untethered Sky by Fonda Lee I bought at Koaz Books in Las Cruces, New Mexico, as so many other books are. I read this back in April and I just loved it. It's a short novel. I think it's actually a novella. It's only about 150 pages long, and it is just a fascinating book about bonding with people and bonding with animals and dealing with loss and heartbreak. I've seen in some communities people looking at it and thinking that it comes off as like the Dragon Rider series in a way, and on first glance it may look like that, but it is nothing similar. There's no like psychic connection or bond. It really is just falconry, where one person is a human and the other is a roc, a giant bird of prey that could eat humans if it wanted to, and has been trained to prioritize certain kinds of prey that are menaces to people living in the fringes of their society, farmers and travelers and nomads. So this is a book about really just falconry and not really about those kinds of close connections. There's a couple other books here that I read that I thought were really good in the fantasy genre that I've already discussed. There's The Stag Lord, there's Kill the Farm Boy, Dog Days. Those were really good books. I'm not going to show them here. I've shown them on other videos. There is one I really enjoyed as well. I've kind of been on a bird tick lately, and The Black-Tongue Thief is a story where there were these major wars between effectively goblin folk and humans, and generations of people have been lost in these wars. And the goblins, when they realized that human cavalry, the hammer and anvil tactic, was so dreadful to them, developed a disease or something like that that just killed off all horses, to the point where those horses that remain are so few in number, and it killed off, I think it primarily killed off male horses, or it sterilized them such that the horses are gone. Anyone with a horse, one, knows it's on a time limit, and two, rides it around as a sign of prestige and wealth. And so this is one of those settings where there's no horses because of a cataclysmic event, and that actually plays into the story. It's a grim, dark fantasy though, and it really is focused on like an end of the world story. It isn't quite the end of the world, but there's elements of that type of fantasy. So The Black-Tongue Thief I thought was really enjoyable for a lot of reasons that I haven't mentioned, and you know, a lot of the reasons I have. There's a lot to that book, and I'll cover it in a video someday. There's this book. This is one of the ones I'm including kind of just, it was alright. I thought it didn't really do much that I wanted it to. I was intrigued by the back cover's description, the summary, but what I got wasn't really what I thought I was going to get when I read it. So this is The Woodcutter by Kate Danley. And I thought, given the description, that The Woodcutter was going to be like more fairy based in a way. Really, it's set in this setting where the fairy tales are actually happening, and Hansel and Gretel, Cinderella, Princess and the Pea, those kinds of stories are contemporary and happening in the plot. And the evil queen, the evil queen from like Snow White, is trying to take over the realms and utilize the power of fairies and their magic to propel her to be more powerful. The fairies, for their part, are trying to be a bit more passive. They can end the humans if they want. they don't want to do that. And so they have an agent, the woodcutter, who is supposed to maintain a certain sort of balance and remind the humans why he exists and why the fairies should not be abused or mistreated by humans. It was alright, though. It wasn't as good as I was hoping it would be. Another alright book that I read in the fantasy genre this year is A Broken Blade, which has been it's that book up on the shelf, and it was alright. I felt a lot of the plot elements to be very predictable, and predictable in a way that I just don't gel with. But it was a fun book to some degree, so I put it in the alright. It's not bad, it's just not great. That's kind of opposite my reaction to the next set of books. Another couple books that I read in the fantasy genre that I just didn't gel with were the Highwayman books by R.A. Salvatore. I read The Ancient and The Highwayman, books 2 and 1 respectively. And, I thought they were okay, but the method for which the character beats his handicap is something that just I didn't gel with. It was, ironically enough, and they reference this, is it basically his method turns into a crutch, and I just didn't like it. Another book I read this year and absolutely did not like was The Iron Wolves. I thought, maybe this is going to be mercenaries getting back in the game for one last major fight, and then it pulls a Deus Ex Machina in the dumbest way possible, and I just hated that ending. And that style of dark fantasy is just so obnoxious. The Black Tongue Thief did it really well. The Iron Wolves, not at all, in my opinion. So, both dark fantasies, but one really takes itself seriously and the other feels like they needed to put in as many curse words as possible. It's kind of like how you look at the Dota animated series on Netflix, how they're just throwing around curse words every chance they get, even if it doesn't make sense to use that curse word in that context. So that's what the Iron Wolves felt like to me. As far as memoirs go, there's a couple books I really absolutely loved this year. The Ways of My Grandmothers is a book I'm going to cover. If I haven't already or mentioned it already, this book is going to be covered during Women's History Month this year. It is a fascinating story about a Native American woman, a First Nations woman in Canada, and her discussing the things she learned from her grandmothers, or the women of a generation equivalent to her grandma, who are respected highly in their community. And there's recipes about using like buffalo, or in this case cow intestine, to effectively make like a bison sausage that is smoked on a fire, and other recipes that were just really fascinating to me. The methods of beating and making shoes, all of these things are fascinating to me, and it shows a deep respect for her community and her elders in a way that I really, really, really love. So The Ways of My Grandmothers by Beverly Hungry Wolf, very, very good. Another one I really loved this year was Cliffs and Challenges. It's the life of Laura White Brunner. So she was a young woman who was working at Yosemite National Park at one of the resort parts of it, and was rambunctious and exploratory, and she never ended up hired as a ranger, but it covers her memoirs of 2 different years that she worked. her mother was poor and somehow found a job for both of them at the resort, but the leadership, the management of that resort changed from one year to the other that she works there, and she has a lot less fun in the second year that she works. But it's still a really fascinating story, really interesting pictures that are being presented, and reminded me a lot of the earlier chapters in National Parks and the Women's Voice, which I did cover earlier this year. So Cliffs and Challenges, The Ways of My Grandmothers, those are two really, really good books I loved. Books and Islands in Ojibwe Country. I had that book when I presented it. I don't have that book now because it's at my girlfriend's place. It's her book. She read that book in a course that she took in her undergrad and kept it because it's a really, really fascinating book. So there's that one. And then there's also, as far as memoirs go, it's not quite a memoir, but it's a history with a lot of memoir retelling. Come and Get It, which I made a video about as well. I was intrigued by Farewell, My Subaru. I really love books about people that live in the New Mexico area, and especially people that live in New Mexico. Gary Paul Nabin, Tucson area, very fascinating. Terry Tempest Williams, the Four Corners part of Utah, very, very fascinating writing. And, you know, there was that book about the fire lookouts. That book, Fire Season, really, really good book. And actually takes place in the same part of New Mexico as Farewell, My Subaru. But Farewell, My Subaru feels like, oh, I'm going to pat myself on the back, show everyone how good I am for living clean and carbon neutral. You know, it feels like bleeding heart content that is just too self-congratulatory. It was good content, but the bad and the good really balance it out to be just all right. And then one book that I have here is probably the worst book I read this year. I finished it and I felt betrayed, and on multiple levels. I picked up this book, The Blood Runs Like a River Through My Dreams, a memoir by Nasdish. I picked it up for $8 at Brave Books in El Paso back in, I think, 2021 when I first went there, and I never got around to reading it. But over Memorial Day weekend, I had a chance and I read it. And I was intrigued by the content until I started looking it up because something didn't sit right with me, like there was too much drama happening or something like that. And so I looked up the author and found out that this was written by a guy writing under a pseudonym. But what makes this one absolutely atrocious and vile is that it's written as if it were a Diné man, a Navajo man, writing about his trials and tribulations living on res, and how he tried to do best for his son and how his son died because of fetal alcohol syndrome, I think is what it is. But looking into it, it turns out the author is actually a white child of immigrants from like Minnesota who did some social work in that area and then decided, I'm going to write about this content as if I were actually a Navajo man. It is just vile. I do not think there's any place for it in any literacy, in any literature context. I don't think this kind of writing is good. If he had written it as a fantasy or a fictional story, that might have been all right. It would have been fetishizing the Navajo in certain ways or on-res life, but it wouldn't have been as gross and atrocious to me as the way he presented it as nonfiction, as a memoir. and then it turns out this is all a fraud. The author's note says this work is a memoir and represents to the best of my ability and my memory an accurate reporting of facts and events as I know them and as they have been told to me. I have attempted to protect the privacy of people through the editorial decision to frequently change names, appearances, and locations as they are not relevant to the focus of the work or the issues the work strives to deal with. And it has a comment by Rick Bass on it. And I love Rick Bass. His writing is just fascinating to me. I've talked a lot about Rick Bass in the context of The Lost Grizzlies and Wild to the Heart, but seeing his praise on this book and then finding out this book for what it is really hurts me. And I hope that if this book did manage to get any printings after it turned out to be a fraud and was publicized, that Rick Bass's name was removed from it, because it is just a lie. As far as books in the nature sense that I read, A Shape in the Dark, which is about brown bears in the Kodiak area of Alaska, so not even really grizzlies, but brown bears from the largest subspecies of brown bear. It's a relatively recent book. I bought it for $13. It's copyright 2021. I don't know how I bought it used at Koaz, but I found it and really enjoyed it. So A Shape in the Dark, that was a good book. I also read That Quail Robert early in this year and reviewed it very quickly. It was just really, really fun. Another book I would add is A Rage for Falcons, which is about falconry, which I kind of covered in Untethered Sky, and I'm reading about right now in H is for Hawk, but I guess this year has been big for me on reading about falconry. So this copy is signed in 1994. It is copyright 1984, this printing in 1992. It's a short book with a lot of art. It's only about 130 pages. I'd say probably about 125 when you consider all the art that's in it. And it's one of those books that kind of annoys me because of how wide the margins are. But it's really nice, and there's art like this. Stephen Bodio lives, writes, and hawks in central New Mexico for many years. He has written the well-known Bodio's Review for Gray Sporting Journal. He is the author of Good Guns, Aloft and Querencia. And the cover painting is by John Baumlin. So, illustrated by Jonathan Wild. A very, very fun book to read. That is one of those memoirs. A Rage for Falcon is one of those nature books that I just really enjoyed. It gets into the different types of hawks and falcons you'll find in the area and why you would want to use one over the other. As far as memoirs go that I didn't like, I covered it recently, but The Soul of an Octopus just, I thought it was going to be something, and it turned out not to be that. And that really affected my reading of it. And then on top of that, the content just wasn't the kind of content I like reading about in nature books. It was too human focused to be good. It felt like The Hidden Life of Deer in a way. There wasn't enough that was good about the deer in that book, and too much on the human side of things. And The Soul of an Octopus felt very similar. And lastly, the 40th book I read this year that rounded out my reading challenge's goal was The Naturalist, which I read back in June-ish, I want to say. I picked it up off the shelf because it was sorted into the fantasy and science fiction section. It's just a mystery. It's set in contemporary America. It's not anything special in a fantasy or a science fiction way. It wasn't, I don't think it really was a good mystery, but I was okay with reading it because it had very bite-sized portions. The chapters were short, sweet, and to the point, and that kept a pretty good pace throughout the book. It's a mystery, though, and I never really read those. I think this is the first one I've read in 2 or 3 years, so I'm not sure I'm going to do a video on it because I'm not experienced enough with that genre to feel like I can do that genre justice and do that book justice in a video. I also, as a last book, read a third-party D&D supplement called Green Races that just really got to me. Over my right shoulder, you'll sometimes see role-playing game books there. Koaz Books has a pretty good selection of third-party D&D books, as well as minor publishing companies' books. And so, for example, AEG had one. I think it's called Spycraft that I had up there for a bit. Right now, I have Heroes of the Forgotten Kingdoms, Dungeons and Dragons 4th edition up there. Green Races was for 3rd edition, but was written so hilariously poorly, I couldn't hold on to it. A friend wanted it for his collection, and he paid me for it. It was just so poorly written, and when I shared it on a Discord server with people that really love Dungeons and Dragons 3rd edition, we just were laughing at it for so long. There were aspects of it that just mystified me. Prestige classes that were basically just a glorified feat, as well as a base class that didn't follow a standard fortitude, reflex, will, save progression, or even base attack bonus progression. It was full base attack bonus, but somehow ended up with like plus 20, plus 12, plus 8, plus 2 at 20th level. Like, that's not how base attack bonus works at all. So the content in it was just so funny to me because it was so poorly edited. It did not feel like it was actually made for 3rd edition, and some of the people on that server pointed out it looks like it may have been written by people that were accustomed to writing for 2nd edition. Yeah, it just really tickled me pink. So yeah, 2024 is going to be a good year, and I hope to keep doing this for you guys in a good and hopefully improving my methods way. Anyway, my name is Wildstag, and thank you for tuning in to this year's 2023 Year in Review.